morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this, the second in our webinar series looking at the role of hydrogen in decarbonising the UK economy. My name is Liam Flynn. I'm a Managing Associate in the Energy, Waste and Sustainability team here at Freeths. And I'm delighted to be joined by our panel of speakers and experts for today's discussion, which is looking at the role that hydrogen is playing and can play in the decarbonisation of transport, with a particular focus on road and rail. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Freeths, we are a national law firm with 12 offices around the UK. We're one of the very few firms with a dedicated energy, waste and sustainability practice, focusing exclusively on clean tech, renewable energy and sustainability solutions for our clients. We're also very fortunate to have a dedicated transport sector team, and I'm delighted that Iain Bowler and Tom Johnson from that sector team are here to join today's discussion. So, hydrogen in transport. We move to the next slide, please, Tom. Now, the scale of the task to decarbonise the transport sector shouldn't be undersold. Last year, the UK transport sector contributed nearly 30% of UK's carbon emissions, with road and rail contributing 23% of that alone. And it's not difficult to see how it's come to be. Over the past, let's say, century and a half, we've seen the development of the internal combustion engine and the proliferation of those engines to enable us to each relatively cheaply own a car, fly around the world, and order something online for it to be delivered next day. The vast majority of our modern world and its development has revolved around getting people or things around using engines that use fossil fuels. Now, for much of that time, there haven't really been any viable alternatives that were as cost efficient or as powerful as fossil fuels. And it's hardly surprising when you think that, in the US, a gallon of petrol costs less than a gallon of milk. And it has more energy potential than 130 sticks of dynamite. It's the petrol, not the milk. But in the ever-evolving landscape where climate change is at the top, or at least near the top, of many people's agendas, over-reliance on fossil fuels is no longer the boon it once was. And governments and industry alike have been looking at alternatives. So if we move to the next slide, please. In the great debate of zero emissions vehicles, hydrogen fuel cells will continually come up against batteries and electrification. Now, for a lot of people, batteries are seemingly the answer. The technology, particularly for personal vehicles and public transport like buses, is proven and increasingly becoming cost competitive against fossil fuel equivalents. Whereas hydrogen vehicles, either based on fuel cells or synthetic replacement fuels, are significantly more costly and lag behind batteries for infrastructure. And those same arguments are lobbied against hydrogen for rail, where electrification has been around since the 1890s. But there is at least one sizable problem with using batteries alone for transport. Current battery tech doesn't have the same energy density as hydrogen or of existing fossil fuels. So, in order to move larger vehicles, you need more batteries to get comparative performance. But every time you add a battery to a vehicle, two key things happen. Firstly, the weight increases, so you need more batteries. But also you take up more space and the vehicle you're moving becomes less useful for transporting cargo and people. Now, at the moment, that tipping point is somewhere around the size of an HGV or slightly larger than a double-decker bus, depending on who you listen to, which on the slide is around where the blue and light green bandings meet. And when you consider how many of our goods in particular are flown, shipped, or transported by rail, it's clear that batteries alone will not be the answer. Which brings us back to hydrogen. Now, as I've already alluded to, there are some existing challenges for hydrogen to break into the transport sector, carve out its own space, and to disrupt the common consensus that only batteries or electrification will save us. For those of you who joined our previous webinar, you'll know that hydrogen should have the ability to help us decarbonise further. It has more energy potential than a number of fossil fuels, is light and can be pressurised or used to make those synthetic fuels that I mentioned earlier, which helps avoid the weight issues of batteries, and it makes no carbon dioxide emissions when burned. But it's an all too familiar story that with hydrogen, we're just at the beginning. Now, before we jump into our panel discussion, I just wanted to outline what has happened and what is currently happening for hydrogen in the transport sector since the announcement of the government's hydrogen strategy last summer. So if we move to the next slide, please, Tom. Now, whilst the strategy was announced to much fanfare, for the transport sector, it was more lukewarm, I'd say. The recommitment of the £23 million Hydrogen for Transport programme, which had already been running since 2017, highlighted the seeming lack of ambition and understanding of the scale of the challenge that is posed for hydrogen mobility. The government's loose ambition for hydrogen mobility is that it will primarily be used for buses and other depot-based vehicles throughout the 2020s. But by 2030, it will start to be used across HGVs, buses and rail, along with early adopters in commercial shipping and aviation. Other commitments from that strategy include the launch of the Zebra scheme to deliver 4,000 zero emissions buses, which has now had increased funding to 270 million, investing 20 million in designing trials for electrical road system and hydrogen fuel cell HGVs, and plans for the UK's first hydrogen transport hub in Tees Valley and a further one at Holyhead in Wales. And since then, just over a year ago, there have been some more interesting developments. So in July this year, the Department for Transport announced the outcomes of its consultation amending the Renewable Transport Fuels Obligation, which allowed green hydrogen to be classed as a renewable transport fuel. Those changes also ensured that standalone electrolyzers that produce green hydrogen, which are not co-located with generation at plants, would still have their product qualify under the scheme. Now that should help scale up production and demand whilst overcoming a potential costly barrier to adoption, which would have forced everyone who wanted to create an electrolyzer project to have also bolted on their own renewable or co-located solar/battery/wind project as well. Further to that, following the success of the £20 million zero emissions road freight trials programme, a £200 million demonstrator programme was also launched to demonstrate zero emission HGV technologies at scale on UK roads. And there was also the formal launch of the Jet Zero strategy, covering the approach to reaching net zero in the aviation sector by 2050. And in that strategy, hydrogen commercial aircraft featured relatively prominently, particularly in light of the announcements from Airbus to have its first hydrogen commercial aircraft by 2035, and the development of the Zero Avia joint venture, which includes Shell, British Airways, and Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Ventures as its investors. If we move to the next slide, please, Tom. So, all in all, things are starting to look quite positive for the role of hydrogen in transport. But it still appears that we're, towards the start of that journey. Clearly, there are things happening, which leads me on to our panelists, all of whom have had some involvement in the hydrogen and transport journey to date. So very quickly, if I can ask each of the panelists to give a very quick overview of their experience and their role in the hydrogen journey so far, and then we can get into the meat of the discussion. So let's start with Dr. Stuart Hillmansen.
Hello there, and thank you very much, Liam, for the introduction, setting the scene for this panel discussion. Yeah, so my name's Stuart Hillmansen. I'm a Professor of Railway Traction Systems at the University of Birmingham, and my team have been looking at hydrogen applications for rail for nearly 20 years now. We realised there was going to be a problem with the availability of diesel going forward, and given the timescales that rail operate on, and we realised we needed to start thinking about it. So in about 2012, my team built the first sort of narrow gauge locomotive, fifth scale locomotive, and trialled that and showcased it in the UK and the world, and that got people to realise that hydrogen had a role to play in decarbonising and providing autonomous fuel for rail traction. I should say that rail has already got a proven solution for decarbonisation in that we can electrify railways, and that absolutely is the best way of decarbonising heavy duty, high performance, high speed, high capacity railways. So those of you who lived in London, if you've taken a ride on the Elizabeth line, that's electrified for very good reasons. We're not suggesting we'd run fuel cells through a tunnel underneath London like that. However, most of the railways around the world aren't electrified, and we haven't got the time or the money to electrify global railways, and ourselves at the university and colleagues around the world globally are heavily investing in hydrogen for rail. There's somewhere near to something like 50 rail vehicles in service or about to enter service. So I think my message is this is happening in rail, and it's going to provide a solution for our decarbonisation challenge. So thank you, Liam. Over to the next panelist.
Super. Thanks, Stuart. If we go to Patrick next.
Thank you very much. So my hydrogen journey started 5 or 6 years ago now in my former role with Go Ahead Group, based within their Southeast bus operating business, Brighton and Hove buses and Metrobus of Crawley. We were challenged by my then MD, Martin Harris, to, well, our engineering colleagues were challenged to work out how we would do our sort of 400 or 500 bus business in zero emission if we had to tomorrow. And that led to an evaluation of the various technologies and a fairly quick realisation that actually if you want to have a bus on the road for up to 370 miles in a day on a duty cycle, as many of our intensive operations in the southeast are, or for up to 24 hours a day, then the only real way of doing that was with fuel cell electric technology. And I guess that's an approach I bring that actually I think the nation is quite comfortable with electrification. I'm not talking about anything that isn't electrification. It's exactly the same on the street. It's silent. It's smooth and it's comfortable. My only challenge is how we get power to the vehicle and whether it can then do a day's work over a 15-year lifespan. So fuel cell electric is very much the favoured option as far as I'm concerned. Before I left Go Ahead, I managed to fund 54 buses in our Crawley Metrobus operation, the first of which actually arrive in November this year. So it will be moving from talking the talk to seeing it walk now, which I'm really pleased to do. And then I joined Liverpool City Region Combined Authority just as the pandemic was hitting and we were heading into the first lockdown. I managed to get up to Man Island and pick up my laptop and phone before being forced to work from home like the rest of us. Initially on a secondment, but now as a permanent member of the team as of the start of this year. So I've overseen the procurement of our first 20 hydrogen fuel cell buses there. They arrive at the end of this year as well, so clearly learned how to do this stuff a bit quicker in the more recent time. I'm now doing the strategy for how we decarbonise the whole regional bus fleet of 1,200 buses. So really pleased to be doing this, but very much keen to challenge the sort of silo working that can naturally occur. So in Liverpool, I'm looking at how our big regional bus fleet, that's a decent scale of operation, but how that could be used much more efficiently to not just clean up the 4% of emissions that currently come from diesel buses in the region, but how that big scale can enable a lot of the other difficult to decarbonise sectors like dust carts, which I know our friend Simon here will be able to help anyone with who needs to. We've got their first one in St Helens, which is a great opportunity to collaborate there, which we're actively discussing, but how we can bring those other fleets. So for me, what good looks like is a Sainsbury's home delivery van fleet or an Amazon or one of the big sort of logistics providers taking this stuff seriously as well and partnering with us to share. And when we do that, shared sort of refueling infrastructure not only helps reduce the cost of going into the clean energy sector, but it also massively increases the scale for fuel use. So buses can help decarbonise much more of the road network of transport modes, and by working together we can all save money massively, which is a really key area we need to get to if this is going to break through in the way that I believe it can do.
Super, thanks Patrick. And seeing as you mentioned your sort of coordination with Simon, let's go to Simon next.
Yeah, thanks Liam. Good morning everyone. My name's Simon Hyde, the Chief Exec of FAUN UK, which is part of German family Kirchhoff, 3 billion turnover, 5th generation German industrialists. So in 2009, we jumped on this decarbonisation journey, and we've developed, in full collaboration with Daimler AG in Germany, a hydrogen fuel cell chassis. So I mentioned it as chassis, where we realised that there are high energy requirements, not just distance from A to B. With a refuse collection vehicle, there's quite a lot of energy in the packing mechanism, the lifting mechanism. So we were quick to realise that in order to not disrupt the operation, fuel cell was the operative choice. As a company, we're technically agnostic, so we can put our bodies on electric chassis as well, as we do. But at the moment where we are now, we've got two chassis, an 18-ton and a 27-ton, and we've achieved OEM status with Daimler. So the product is now ours. FAUN Ingenious is the company we've set up. 18-ton and a 27-ton Econic, and it's just a chassis. So we can provide a chassis for a garbage truck, a road sweeper, or a box, or a fridge. So we buy the glider from Daimler, we install the electronic componentry, and it is our product. Type approved. We have an order book, a business. It is a business for us. It's got its own balance sheet, profit and loss, management team, directs and indirects, all that stuff. We've got an order book of 132 units, 42 are running around Europe, Germany, Belgium, and have done for the last 3 years, picking up rubbish, not disrupting the operation. And I'm delighted to say we had our first one, as Patrick's referenced, delivered to St Helens a couple of weeks ago. So we're taking little steps. The first one's arrived, it'll be working, but we forecast by 2024 we could have up to 10 to 12 units operating in the UK. I'm very keen to exploit other non-RCV applications like road mixers or anywhere where high energy is required, where 24/7 cycling is also a demand for the operation. So it's out there, it's up and running, and not PowerPoint, it's real. Type approved, OEM status.
Fab, thanks Simon. And let's go to Iain and Tom, seeing as you're sat together. I'll let you two decide who goes first.
Looks like it's me. Thank you, Liam. My name is Tom Johnson. I'm a partner in the commercial team here at Freeths. I'm a specialist rail sector lawyer and have been for over 20 years, but in that time I've actually done a lot of work in the bus sector as well. I've acted for the Department for Transport, for the Office of Rail and Road, for various lessors, financiers, manufacturers and operating companies. My business tends to focus on asset finance transactions in both the passenger and freight sector, on vehicle procurement, leasing and maintenance, franchising and concessions, and a whole raft of related commercial contracts. Now, decarbonisation is obviously a very hot topic everywhere, and particularly in the rail sector. Rail already enjoys a certain environmental advantage over other transport modes, but it's been brought into focus by the fact that, as I'm sure everyone knows, the government is committed to the removal of all diesel rolling stock from the Great British network by 2040 and in fact 2035 in Scotland. Now, given some of the challenges involved in terms of identifying a sort of coherent industry-wide strategy, the development of new legislation, standards and approvals, the need for cross-sector cooperation, and to have in place a functioning supply chain, that actually doesn't leave much time, and these challenges need to be grappled with sooner rather than later. So it's a little surprising really that so far, although everybody's talking about decarbonisation, not a great deal has happened, with the exception of the project that Stuart's been involved in and one in Scotland. The debate is focused on electrification versus batteries versus hydrogen, and there's a sense that each of those modes has their supporters and their champions, and the debate has become quite polarised. But the reality is, given the timescales we're working to, we're going to need all three, and there needs to be some progress pretty soon, I would say. Iain.
Thanks, Tom. And good morning, everybody. My name is Iain Bowler. I'm a partner also in the commercial group. I've spent the last 25 years working both in transport and in the warehousing and logistics sectors. And a good deal of that work has been involved procuring vehicles, railway rolling stock, both passenger trains and also freight locomotives, and also light rail vehicles, better known as trams, and also the procurement of buses and heavy goods vehicles, along with the related maintenance, in many cases, which comes from the vehicle OEM. In relation to rail, as Stuart and Tom have alluded to, there are different solutions in relation to decarbonisation, depending upon different segments of the market, whether it's urban, interurban, intercity, for example. And in relation to road freight, I think there are also multiple use cases which deserve consideration of different solutions from an operational point of view. And so it's no different sort of when weighing up the options to look at different segments of the market in different ways. And so it's very much for me a horses for courses approach in terms of road. I think government, as Tom has mentioned with rail, government has also set out a strategy that will involve the ban on sale of new fossil fueled HGVs from 2040. And also in relation to trucks weighing 26 tonnes or less, they're to be banned from 2035. And so from my point of view, at least until we get into a more full-blown debate around hydrogen being used as a fuel in internal combustion engines, as Liam has pointed out, a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is just an electric vehicle. So the issue is around looking at the pros and cons from an operational, from a total cost of ownership, and from a procurement point of view of hydrogen fuel cell electric versus battery electric. And for me, where I see hydrogen fitting into the equation, it is part of the solution for heavy duty applications. So bus and coach, specialist vehicles that have high power requirements, and also in the heavier segments of road haulage from sort of 25 tonnes to 44 tonnes. And I think talking to 3PL clients, the overwhelming view that we've had in those conversations is that for the heavier categories of road haulage, battery electric isn't going to provide an adequate solution. I mean, we'll wait and see what the Tesla Semi, which I think is probably the correct pronunciation in American, what that's going to perform like when it goes on sale in December this year. But for now, I think the current thinking is that battery electric is good for parcel delivery and possibly even this palletized segment of the haulage market. But in relation to those specialist applications, the sort that Simon's talking about, and also in the 25 to 44 tonne segment, I think that fuel cell electric is going to play a significant role, despite a number of naysayers in the marketplace at the moment.
Super, thanks, Ian. And I think that's probably a really good point to sort of jump off the discussion. Obviously, I touched on it in the introduction. I think everyone has, spoken about this, sort of difference of opinion as to where electrification and batteries lie. But I think let's go to Stuart and Tom first, because I think, Stuart, you were saying something quite interesting about, where you see electrification / batteries as against hydrogen. So from a rail perspective, where do you see hydrogen fitting into, overall decarbonisation of the rail side? And, what does that look like in the next, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, thanks for that, Liam. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, and something that Tom has mentioned, there's advocates for each technology, but I think that's if we have advocates for each, but they don't work together, we're going to end up with some suboptimal solutions. And from a rail transport point of view, and something Simon was saying, adopting a sort of a modular approach where we've got a standard traction package, traction motor and converter, and then you just get the electricity either from overhead wires or third rail or fuel cell plus battery, and it's just the mix of those components that change the type of vehicle that you've got. And if we adopt that strategy, you can build rail vehicles that will could start life as a fuel cell battery vehicle, but as electrification proceeds at the same time, some of those vehicles, after 20 years, the fuel cell might be removed because it could be running underneath wires. So we need to think about our vehicles over quite a long time scale. The battery technology and fuel cell technology and hydrogen storage technology is likely to change over that time scale, and we need to be able to upgrade and change them during their life. I think my concern is if we just focus on electrification as a solution for rail, there will be quite a lot of our routes that carry on using quite dirty diesels all the way up till 2040, and from my point of view, I think that will rapidly become unacceptable for the passenger's point of view, because in the intervening time, automotive will pretty much have cleaned up its act. There'll be few and far between petrol and diesel cars on the road. So why will people get on a a train that's got very, very poor emissions, quite noisy and smelly and so on. So I think it's more about keeping up with the competitors as well. So my view is we tackle electrification projects like the sensible ones that make a good strong business case, but at the same time develop hydrogen and battery vehicles for the parts of the route that they'll work really well for, and there are lots of them around the country. And as I said in my introduction, it's actually a global thing. I mean, we speak at the university. My team speak to railways all around the world. We're doing a lot of work in Africa, South America, North America, Japan, China. Everyone has got the same problems, and we need to work together to come up with a solution that will work for railways.
Yeah, and I suppose the sort of the hidden point around electrification is in order to decarbonize the whole sector, you're only decarbonising if you're putting green and renewable electricity into the rails themselves. So it's sort of it naturally means that it's part and parcel working together. And I think it's interesting that. Certainly, Tom, I know you had an experience at a recent conference that I think Stuart was at as well, where there were a lot of people who were saying, "Oh, it's not a viable solution at the moment," but thinking about it very much in the abstract. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that, Tom.
Yes, of course. No, that's absolutely right. I mean, I fully agree with everything that Stuart was saying about the need for coordination. The rail sector in particular is strikingly government controlled. Not much happens without government approval, particularly now that the government is funding so much of it since the pandemic. But there is a marked absence of clear government strategy, and I think that's a really significant barrier at the moment to any real progress. It's widely acknowledged that the early Pathfinder projects will be more expensive than the subsequent ones, and who's going to take that risk without any certainty that their investment is going to result in something that's being implemented. I think the thing that's particularly interesting with hydrogen is that given the challenges that I'm sure we'll come onto in terms of generation and delivery of hydrogen, probably the only way to make it viable for the rail sector is in combination with other sectors as part of a wider hydrogen economy. But it's hard to see how that's going to happen without government support and very probably government subsidy, which is a tricky topic right now.
Yeah, well, let's park that because we'll come to sort of challenges in a sec and pivot slightly away from the rail side of things. Simon, Patrick, what are your thoughts on where hydrogen is going to fit into buses, HGVs, and sort of anything slightly larger than a personal vehicle over the next 10-15 years?
Jumping quickly, so my view is that we've had trials now of both technologies, or a few more than both. The time for trials is really behind us. We need, if we're going to sort of meet the ambitious targets that have been set, we need to be now thinking very strategically about what's going to deliver, not just now and scaling up those fleets as fast as possible, but how they'll last the course in the future. We've got a lot of electric buses on the road in the country. Some of the first ones of those are only 8 years old and are already requiring full upgrades and replacement drive lines, not just battery replacements, but the whole drive line at the cost of another diesel bus, which is not a nice amount of money to be spending on an 8-year-old vehicle that's just past its half-life. So we really need to think about what's going to deliver for us and what's going to be scalable, what will help bring the price down. There's lots of government money going into decarbonising buses at the moment. There's only 38,000 buses on the road in the UK. It's a cottage industry. They're built by hand amongst a small number of manufacturers. And if we keep trying to pick low-hanging fruit for a technology that isn't fit, we know, for purpose for every application, then we're going to be diluting the opportunity to bring the price down of the technology that is fit for purpose. So we really need to start thinking about delivery and past trials. We also need to think about, whilst there's a lot of focus on bus at the moment in serious volume, how that also enables the other vehicles around them to transition. So just as I was saying earlier on, but let's hear from Simon as well.
Yeah, Liam, I mean, it's very clear for me that, you know, the one thing that we focused on is that we can't disrupt an operation just because we used a different technology, and our trucks use a lot of energy. And if you're going to sweat the asset, you know, battery technology we think isn't right for high energy use. Battery technology for low energy use is appropriate for sure. So the vehicles that go around in the city, that's fine. But Patrick's right. I mean, the time for development has gone. We've got product, and there's companies out there that've got product. And I think the best way to deal with it, and we have skirted the discussion earlier within the Northwest. So there's a hub. So if we drop technologies in a local hub and start to use it locally, so Patrick and I are talking about potentially using the same fuel station to fuel a bus, to fuel a truck. At the moment, as an RCV, there's nothing to stop the hub in the area buying a chassis on a fridge or a cement mixer. The technology's there, we've just got to use it. And in terms of the fueling, because I know that's a subject of interest, you know, we basically bring in a pod, for want of a better phrase, with tanks of hydrogen in. And it's one or two trucks, so you don't need a colossal amount, but it gets the thing going. It kicks the thing off. It's real. We can get data. It's out of the PowerPoint. It's out of the development stage, and it's absolutely vital that we make those investments in a local area like Tees Valley in the Northwest and South Wales, and also the private sector have got a role to play. I noticed yesterday that in Pembroke they've got a Norwegian company that have committed to £20 million worth of investment in hydrogen, and we just exploit those opportunities. If we've got investors in a region, let's use the regions to use as clusters to capitalise and use the technology and test it. That's my view. But Patrick's right. It's most important that we join the dots and don't do it in isolation. We cannot afford to do it in isolation. So bus, car, truck, high truck, low truck.
No, I think that's right, Simon. And I think the point you make about the fact that it's not a PowerPoint anymore. You know, these are living, breathing things, and you know, we've got 3 external speakers here who are all doing stuff and all have either got a product, facilitated a product, or are procuring those products. You know, it's very much a thing happening today. I suppose that sort of comes back to Tom's question as to how do we get from talking about these things to having these things to actually getting them out into the world. What are the big challenges that you're seeing stopping adoption of hydrogen vehicles across the full spectrum of the sector? Sort of an open question. Anyone can jump in with that one.
Well, if I might jump in on that one, St Helens, I was delighted. Were very, very forthright in their thinking, and they've gone to their own treasury to invest in the truck, and it's one truck, so little steps to make sure that they got it right, because in the region there is a thought that they could use hydrogen from an output from some of the manufacturing processes up there. So they're politically driven and focused on it, and they've made the leap of faith and made that decision. And I think it's as simple as that. Having the guts to be able to invest in that technology if it's an important part of that particular region. And if there's a cluster of hydrogen being manufactured through other processes, it should be capitalised on, because then you'll have the attraction of private sector, like the company I referenced to in Pembroke, because there's a Milford Haven contract there and all that's going on. But I think the government could help stimulate some pockets. I don't think it's, they've got a lot on their plate at the moment. So I'm sure other people will be suggesting funds go elsewhere. But I think it's important that maybe they stimulate the zones that have already started interest in hydrogen, like Tees Valley in Scotland and South Wales and Northwest.
I think Simon's bang on. It really is all about the fuel. The bus or truck procurement is, although still in quite small numbers, it's a business as usual transaction apart from the price. And certainly in bus, we've seen rapid progress on price. They've halved the price of hydrogen fuel cell electric buses in the last 5 years. So it's not going to be, you can see a pathway to those coming down with more scale. The real challenge, as I plan deployments of buses across the Northwest, is how we get the fuel when it becomes green enough, and that's a chicken and egg situation at the moment, because there hasn't been the demand. Now the demand is growing, we really need to see incentivization for local green production, whilst not ignoring oodles of quantities of hydrogen that's produced as waste from local industrial processes, provided they're not having to do more of it to supply. So big fan of using what's on your doorstep if you can do. At the moment, that's not easy.
Yeah, and I suppose one of the things that you know, sort of broadening the scope ever so slightly for this point, you know, one of the things that gets lobbied at us when we talk about, you know, net zero is this enormous thing that everybody needs to try and wrap their heads around. And you know, when you're posed with a problem that size, you know, it's overwhelming and it's daunting. And I think there's a tendency to go, okay, what's the easy fix for it? And you know, the point you're making, Patrick, about, you know, how do we get, you know, the green hydrogen into the vehicles? I think the point you were making earlier about, you know, sharing infrastructure is a really interesting one, and I think a lot of people will sort of see that and think about it and go, oh yeah, if we're building out these things for, you know, one development, it makes sense to, you know, economize, you know, make it more straightforward. But I think the flip side of that is, well, a lot of people sort of lack the engagement because they go, oh well, there's already the batteries there, and that's now becoming the norm, quote unquote. And I feel like there's always going to be this tussle between, you know, getting the infrastructure right for one technology or one fuel source, potentially at the detriment of the other. So there's always, I feel like, going to be a bit of a competition. But it sort of goes back to the point you were making with Simon, that, you know, we have to work together to sort of wholesale solve these issues.
I think,
sorry, go on, Iain.
Sorry, Liam. I think just picking up on the point that Simon made, and also, you know, we've worked with Liverpool City Region for a long time now on a whole range of different initiatives and projects. But you know, this idea that Simon mentioned about, you know, local solutions, and I know you know, the combined authority in Merseyside is very big on local solutions for local people. You know, and I think building small, building out regional hubs or regional hydrogen generation, hydrogen distribution infrastructure, which is available to all of the users of hydrogen in that area in order to create a demand. You know, whether this is, I know there are some infrastructure funds representatives listening in the audience, and you know, whether this is an area for public-private partnerships in the future. Certainly, I think the approach to creating micro hydrogen economies or a hydrogen ecosystem needs a project-based approach. It needs to look at all of the different aspects, both from in terms of supply of vehicles, generation of hydrogen, you know, all the way down through training maintenance teams in the use of fuel cell and the maintenance of fuel cell, and you know, even down to insurance. You know, what are the insurance issues around hydrogen fuel cell vehicles versus battery electric versus fossil fuel, for example? And you know, as I said, whether there is a role for, you know, public-private partnerships with infra funds, seeing that this is an area for the future, in the way I think that they're starting to see, or they are seeing, that batteries, you know, large battery storage schemes are a place where they can be investing and helping build out the next generation of infrastructure. There, I think, for me, there'll be a tipping point where hydrogen is seen not as a you know, an optimistic experiment, but actually, you know, is going to provide a very significant part of a mixed fuel solution going forward, and therefore gain that credibility that will enable private sector money and infrastructure funds money to take a proper look at it, and so we don't necessarily have to rely exclusively on, you know, on government financial support as we go forward.
I think one of the things we've been referencing in many of those comments is the social value. And when I talk about social values are an increasingly important additional criteria in our procurement decisions in the Liverpool City region. And it's not just about the local air quality and the health benefits that come from making these decisions, or the jobs and skills that will be created. We've been big on that with the first hydrogen buses, ensuring that operators embrace the technology and upskill their existing engineers and apprentices in the future. And I know that's something that Simon's massively passionate about as well. I'm sure there's opportunities for us to collaborate further there as well. But social value is so much more than just local. There's regional. We're really keen on retrofitting as part of, or repowering as part of our drive to get to a zero emission bus fleet, where we take some of those youngest, cleanest diesel vehicles at some point, or hybrids, and look at repowering those to be fuel cell, reducing the cost a bit further, putting the squeeze on manufacturers of new vehicles to continue sharing the reductions in prices as they sell more of these vehicles, but also the potential for supplying those outside of our region to the wider industry as a whole. And then there's the hydrogen sector, how we're helping to stimulate and grow that, not just within the region, but across the nation. And I think when you look at technology, sort of where the components come from and the various different ingredients, the battery electric sector is dominated by China. We've seen anyone who's tried to buy a car in recent years, the havoc that has been created by lack of supply of various components that only China can give you. We know geopolitically they're nowhere near as close to us on so many areas. Is that a reliance we want to continue stimulating, or do we want to try and carve out some independence here, so that we're not cap in hand to the Chinese? So we've really got to think much wider than the immediate task in front of us, and that goes beyond modes, beyond technologies, and sort of internationally as well.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. Two threads to what you said there, Patrick. One is certainly the social. I think you're well aware of my passion for the younger generation, and what we're doing at FZ is in St Helens is we're working with the local schools to show and demonstrate what the new technology is, to get that technology and that understanding at a younger generation. And we're also contributing towards how the local college is structuring their training, and we're working with them on their curriculum. So I think that's a really, the vehicle is going to be going to St Helens, but it's not actually going to pick up a bin for some months, and that's deliberate. We want to make sure that the vehicle goes round to the schools, local authorities, the community. So as part of that, it's managing the change. We're forgetting that. It's a colossal move from industrial internal combustion engine technology to this. We're all fearful of change, so we've had to embrace a change management process and technologies and techniques to get that in. And it's really important that we sell that concept to the community as one point. And the second thread is definitely the geopolitical one. We're very, very reliant on the Pacific Rim and China in particular for battery technology, and it spooks the hell out of me. And I think we've got an opportunity for us to become hugely independent, to manage and ensure against further energy crises that are looming. I think that's really got to be intensified, and if the Taiwan situation accelerates even worse, that's just going to compound it. So I think we've really got to focus on becoming self-sufficient, and hydrogen is a good methodology to do that.
No, I think that's a fair point to make. Tom, Stuart, from a rail perspective, we've heard sort of a lot from the road angle. We touched on government support earlier, but what other challenges do you think you're facing in the rail sector to help get projects like Hydroflex into adoption, maybe not in the UK, but certainly wider afield? I know that there are a lot of things going on, particularly in Europe, specifically Germany, around this sort of thing. So, there are mechanisms out there that can help this. What do you think is lacking from the UK side at this point?
Yeah, I think I'm just picking up on a few of these points, Liam. Germany and France are definitely ahead of us on this, and have got real orders in and are running. Germany have been running hydrogen trains since 2018, the Alstom Island, and that's really successful. It's achieved huge mileage. It recently did a 1,200 kilometre journey. So it's got the record for the furthest hydrogen train. So the technology is there, and you can order it, and it will arrive in good time, and can be operational. I think there are barriers in the UK, but equally the rail industry has got a good understanding about how to develop projects. I'm picking up on Simon mentioned the Stadcraft project in Pembrokeshire. I know a little bit about that Pembroke project, partly because I grew up in Pembrokeshire, and the railway around there is kind of perfect for hydrogen, and it's going to be in the last in the queue for electrification. You know, if we try and electrify it, it'll be 2050 or 2060 or something. We find by the time we get round to electrifying that part of the railway. But right now we can form a project where we get renewables that will drive electrolyzers to produce hydrogen for rail. And the great thing about rail is the demand for hydrogen is really consistent. So we can set up a rail service that will have a certain quantity of takeoff that's guaranteed over 20 years. And once you've got that, you can then track the capital investment to pay for the renewables, pay for the electrolyzer, and so on. And then I think the other thing is, if we start producing hydrogen at railway scale, which is 10 tons a day or and upwards, we've automatically got a large scale capability that then can feed into other sectors. So running refuge trucks and other delivery vehicles, local bus fleets. And in Pembrokeshire, the other sort of exciting part is decarbonising the port. So the port at Fishguard and at Milford Haven, there's just so many things, so many boxes it ticks to produce green hydrogen in those locations. And I think that's, we have to be thinking about electrolyzed hydrogen just because of the purity. It's going to be very difficult to get hydrogen piped through the national gas network and then put it into fuel cells. So we have to be thinking about renewables directly connected to electrolyzers in my view. But I think the economics are there. You could deliver projects and make them competitive. The cost of a rail ticket might go up a tiny bit, but not substantially. And you've got a decarbonised system that can run indefinitely. We've kind of solved the problem. Then we can worry about other things.
Super. Well, I'm conscious that we've got maybe 10 or 12 minutes left. So let's move to my favourite type of question with all of these, because it's, there's no, in my view, there's no wrong answer. But imagine that we're in, 2035, we've sort of overcome the issue around delivering large-scale hydrogen projects, specifically green hydrogen, slowly becoming more and more part of the economy. We're moving away from a fossil fuel economy, and you could actually see a hydrogen economy growing. What do you think is going to happen in terms of hydrogen in the transport sector in, from 2035 onwards? And where do you think we'll actually be on our current trajectory at that point? Let's go backwards around the room. So Iain, Tom, what are your thoughts?
Well, from my point of view, Liam, I think it was Bill Gates said that people vastly overestimate the speed of change and innovation in the next 2 years and vastly underestimate the speed of change in the next 10 years. And for me, what I think is quite exciting is the potential for hydrogen-fueled ICEs. I know we've got to get the NOx emissions sorted out and all that sort of stuff, but I think, there are already vehicles being developed. JCB are developing a hydrogen-fueled ICE for off-road use. DAF Trucks have, I think they got the Truck Innovation Award this year for their hydrogen-fueled ICE. And from my point of view, one of the big issues, both with HGVs and buses, is the operational point of view. Where on earth do you charge 75 buses in a bus depot that's big enough for 12 at a time in a 5-hour window between midnight and 5 a.m. when all the vehicles have got to be out on the road fully fueled? And even if you do battery switch, where are you going to keep 75 pre-charged batteries, and how long does it take the maintenance crews to do battery switches on 75 vehicles? It's just not feasible in my view. So either fuel cell electric, or even a straight swap for a diesel engine into an ICE that is fueled with hydrogen, and the only thing that comes out the tailpipe is water, is a much more feasible alternative to achieving decarbonisation without turning operational patterns completely on their heads and causing all sorts of chaos and massive change at the same time when you're changing technology. So that was a long answer. Short answer is hydrogen fueled ICEs by 2035, please.
Yeah, I may add to that. I mean, as you can imagine, in our position, we have fairly strong relationships with all the big truck manufacturers across Europe. And by 2035, there is a considerable trend towards hydrogen fuel cell technology, without question. We were at Iveco the weekend, and they clearly have a mixture of BEV and HG fuel cell, without question. But by 2035, there is a huge crossover to fuel cell technology. In terms of the ICE, when we embarked in this project in UK about 5 or 6 years ago, we did some Google work, and apparently for every £1 you spend on an ICE, you get 28 pence worth of travel, and for every £1 you spend on a fuel cell, you get 67 pence worth of travel. And I'm sure there's people in the room that would debate the numbers, but there's a big shift. And my personal view is, yes, there may be a place for ICE, but it's probably limited. I think the industry is just trying to drag out the tail end of parts and spare parts and all that, which is understandable. It's basic economics while technology runs up. But it's without question the big manufacturers in the truck world see that fuel cell is the place that they'll migrate to, because of the operational demands. 24/7 cannot be supported by battery technology, as Iain has said.
And I'd sort of add to that I think certainly the ICE hydrogen, if it can genuinely become zero emission, probably has its place in vehicles like JCBs, where the real heavy lifting has to be done. I don't think I could justify to communities in Liverpool city region why one community can have a silent vehicle and the other one's got to have one that still makes a noise and vibrates. I think that once people see vehicles that can go out and do a whole day's work quickly, quietly and efficiently, refueled in the same time it takes to fill a tank of diesel, I don't think you'll find anyone wanting to do any differently. So I'd like to think we get to that point, really answering your question, Liam, that everyone smelt the coffee by then, and actually we're exporting both the power and the products globally, and being a leader in this field.
And Patrick, I think with less maintenance.
Yeah.
No, I certainly hope we get to 2035 and we're not having these sorts of discussions, because everyone has, smelt the coffee. I think if we haven't at that point, then I think we're clearly on the wrong trajectory. How quickly that manufactures itself is a completely different question for people far brainier than myself. Tom, Stuart, it's 2035. Where's the rail industry, and where do you want it to be in terms of decarbonisation and the hydrogen story?
I mean, I think it may not be very, very exciting, but I think what we need is a government strategy, clear legislation, clear standards and approvals that have to be met, so that you've got an environment in which people want to and are willing to invest. I mean, if you were a manufacturer now in the rolling stock sector, you would probably focus on hydrogen opportunities in Europe rather than here, because there's just a much more receptive environment, and that clearly needs to change, along with a cost-effective way of delivering hydrogen to the user. Stuart, anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think that's right. My concern is we get left behind. Europe are getting on with it, and around the world we see more schemes. Even one project we worked with Michigan State University and Mott MacDonald in the States, and now they've ordered some Stadler fuel cell trains to run in California, and that's from concept to getting the vehicles pretty quick, 4 or 5 years scale, and they just get on and do it. So we need to do the same thing in this country, I think, is press the go button, and we could see schemes like the Pembroke scheme or railways around Teesside, those sort of places happening really quickly, where we get Hydroflex running in anger, showing that it can produce a comfortable and a boring typical rail journey for passengers. I think picking up on something Patrick said, there was this phenomenon called the Sparks effect in railways, where we started electrifying when it was in the 60s and 70s, and there was an uplift in passenger demand when you changed from a diesel to an electric train, and we hadn't foreseen that, and we termed that the Sparks effect. And I think maybe you're right, Patrick. If more people will get on a fuel cell bus than a one with a diesel engine, just because it's a nicer environment. And the same will be true for a hydrogen train when it replaces a diesel. People will be saying, it's a much better passenger experience as well, rather than having a 7.5 litre diesel engine sitting underneath your feet. So I think we've got that to look forward to as well. So my advice to the sort of government and National Rail, which is changing into Great British Railways, is just let's go. I think the private sector is ready to make the investment and can deliver these schemes economically, and there's no reason why not, really.
Fab, thanks very much. We've had a few questions in, but I'm conscious that we're sort of running out of time. I mean, it's been a really interesting discussion, and I feel like answering any of the questions that have come through would probably spend another 15-20 minutes. So what I suggest we do is we probably call it a day now. If you've sent questions through either before the webinar or during the course of today's session, we'll follow up with people specifically, so that you don't feel like you haven't got the response that you wanted. You can also send further questions to any of the panelists. The contact details of the Freeths team are up on the screen and on the website as well. All that leaves me to do is say thank you very much to everyone who's joined, and thank you in particular to our panelists for a really interesting and engaging discussion. Please keep an eye out for details of our next webinar, which will focus on the role of hydrogen in another part of the UK economy. But until then, thank you very much for joining and have a good day.